Earlier on in my Catholic conversion, if I was traveling, I would attend Mass and be somewhat concerned that I was going to a real Catholic church, as opposed to one of those churches that had Catholic in its name, but was not in communion with the Pope in Rome. I learned to look for a couple of signs. One of them was the Vatican flag, which some churches had and some did not. But the real dead giveaway was during the Eucharistic prayer, where the priest would pray for the Pope as well as their bishop. On Monday, April 21st, 2025, I attended the first Mass where I didn't hear the Pope's name mentioned. It was surreal. And it wasn't because I was at a fake Catholic church. No, it was my home parish. But it was because the Pope had died just hours before Mass. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. I was born in 1981, so Pope Francis was the third pope in my lifetime, but considering my relatively recent conversion to Catholicism, he was the only pope in my lifetime that I recognized as my pope. He wasn't just the spiritual father to 1.3 billion Catholics around the world, he was my spiritual father. Today I want to share a few words from my perspective about Pope Francis for whatever it's worth. I didn't know him personally, I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I want to add my voice out there to the many sound bites that will create a digital footprint that will define his legacy. First, as I mentioned in episode 115, I think Pope Francis had a part in me becoming Catholic. Growing up in my Protestant circles, the papacy was heavily criticized for its opulence, and because we were the type of anti-Catholics that just threw stones with no effort to understand nuance, we didn't appreciate the humility and servitude that popes like John Paul II or Benedict XVI brought to the papacy. So when Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio was elected pope in 2013 and immediately pushed aside some of the opulent vestments and the luxury of the papal apartment for a more humble abode, this immediately appealed to me and many other Protestants in my circle. When asked about some of his decisions in this regard, Pope Francis noted that he wanted to identify with the people, and he felt that many of those luxuries would inhibit him from doing so. A good shepherd should smell like his sheep, and whether you liked him or not, that's who our 266th Pope was. Whether Jorge Bergoglio, the Jesuit priest in Argentina, or Pope Francis, the leader of the Holy Catholic Church, he never lost sight of his calling as a pastor, even while rising up in the ranks of the church. 4 days before his death, despite being bound to a wheelchair and on supplemental oxygen, Pope Francis visited a prison on Holy Thursday. It's typical for priests to wash the feet of parishioners on Holy Thursday during the Mass of the Lord's Supper, but Pope Francis started a tradition where he would go to the prisons and wash the feet of prisoners on Holy Thursday. This year, due to his condition, he was unable to wash their feet, but he personally greeted inmates and gifted them a rosary and a pocket-sized gospel. He said, quote, "I have always liked coming to prison on Holy Thursday to do the washing of the feet like Jesus. This year I cannot do it, but I want to be close to you," end quote. As I've studied the history of the papacy, I think that often the College of Cardinals looks to elect a pope for the time, a leader that they feel they need, a leader that maybe has strengths that his predecessor did not. And I think this is why they, led by the Holy Spirit, elected Jorge Bergoglio to this position. I'd like to think that they felt like the church needed a pastor, and that was the type of person that Cardinal Bergoglio was. A second thing that stands out to me about Pope Francis was his desire for unity. It's only been in more recent years that popes have truly engaged the Eastern Orthodox churches to try and mend the Great Schism. Pope Francis took over where his predecessors left off and made genuine efforts to try and close that gap even more. I am hopeful to see real progress in bringing together the Eastern and Western churches into a more fuller communion in my lifetime, and if that were to happen, we can thank Pope Francis for his role in this. Now, having many traditionalist Catholic friends, I think there were a number of frustrations with Pope Francis, and I'll say that I even had a few. Perhaps one of the biggest frustrations was around his limitations of the Latin Mass. I don't know how much of it was Francis's doing or maybe an agenda of a progressive cardinal, but ultimately the Pope did sign off on those limitations, though I had heard a rumor that he stopped efforts to limit it even more. While that was a frustration, the reason behind his decision had to do with unity. The Vatican had surveyed bishops and found that there was a strong division caused by some of the quote-unquote rad trads that attended the Latin Mass and snubbed their noses at those who attended a Novus Ordo Mass. While thankfully that was very far from my experience with those I knew, I had seen it for myself firsthand in various online forums. I think Pope Francis's intention here was good, but I think the execution was heavy-handed and overboard. But if I could give him the benefit of the doubt, I think it demonstrates how much he desired unity in the church. I'll also add that he made more recent comments about the Second Vatican Council being the future of the church, and I personally think this is great. I think the Second Vatican Council gets a lot of bad rap, but if you were to ever read the documents produced by the council, they are beautiful and stunning expressions of the church's mission. If anything, I think the church has suffered at the hands of progressive bishops that have wanted to use Vatican II as their opportunity to push their own progressive agendas. I think that spirit of unity is what drove Pope Francis to implement the Synod on Synodality, a big effort for the last few years of his life. Yeah, the Synod on Synodality is kind of like the Bodie McBoatface of names, and time will tell what significance it made in the direction of the church. But I think what the Pope ultimately achieved is demonstrating a posture of listening to the people, not just the people inside the church, but also the broader community. And so parishes held listening sessions where that's what they did. They just listened. People shared all sorts of ideas, and the leaders weren't there to debate or get defensive. They were just there to listen, take notes, bring those notes to their bishop, who in turn brought their findings to the Pope. Don't get me wrong, I'm a theological conservative, and there were a lot of things that concerned me about the Synod on Synodality, but one thing I won't fault Pope Francis for is being that type of leader that really wants to listen to his sheep and understands that to do that, he has to get close to them. Perhaps the thing I learned the most from Pope Francis's example was his appeal to mercy and his use of toward language. I talked about this extensively in episode 115, but let me explain briefly what I mean by toward language. In my career in sales, we learned a variety of sales methodologies. A sales methodology is a philosophy, a shared language, and approach to selling. Each company adopts a sales methodology and says, this is our approach to sales. In one of these methodologies, we were introduced to the terms toward and away language. An example of toward language is you can save 15% with a 15-minute phone call. Juxtapose that with a call to action like stop wasting 15%. That's an example of away language. According to this particular sales methodology, away language is much more effective in selling because it creates a sense of urgency. It's meant to prod and shock someone into quick action. Instead of saying, our solution will save you time and money, we were trained to say something like, stop wasting money and valuable time. I've been thinking about this with respect to how we talk about Christianity. In the past, I did extensive writing on blogs and social media, and it often came primarily from a place of criticism. I would often write about what was wrong with the world, and particularly of modern Christianity. It was highly effective at getting the likes and the shares because it was primarily an away language approach that preached to the choir. One day, not too long after I became Catholic, I got the sense that God was saying to me, you're really good at telling the world what's wrong with the world. What if instead you highlighted what is good, truthful, and beautiful about the Catholic Christian faith? I often think about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where Fred Rogers invited us into the world where he showed us what goodness looks like. For example, he didn't preach a sermon about the evils of racism. Instead, he invited Officer Clemens, a black police character on his show, to soak his feet in a baby pool with him on a hot day. It wasn't a show about what not to do in life. It was a show about how to live and create a better world. I watched a documentary on Hulu called The Pope Answers. The producers invited a group of Spanish-speaking young adults from various Spanish-speaking countries to come and ask questions and dialogue with Pope Francis. These young adults came from a variety of backgrounds and lifestyles. For example, there was one gentleman who had been abused by a Catholic priest. There was one woman who had been a nun, left her order, and became a lesbian. There was an individual that identified as transgender. There was another who had an abortion. And then there was one lone young lady who was a faithful and devout Catholic. Each person had a chance to ask the Pope a question, and it pertained to some aspect of their life and lifestyle. It was sort of like, what does the church say to a person like me? I was rather amazed at how much the Pope just listened to the conversation, how little he preached. I'll be transparent in saying that a part of me was rather frustrated with him. I wanted the Pope to say, look, you can either follow Jesus or you can follow your own desires. But he didn't. I just got the distinct impression that with every word, he wanted to draw that person into the arms of Jesus. He didn't want to shut the door on them, but rather leave open the possibility that one day they might reflect upon the Pope's kindness, walk into the church, find Jesus, and find the hope of true love. Pope Francis once said, quote, "This isn't dogma, just my thought. I like to think of hell as being empty. I hope it is," end quote. This statement borders on universalism, and in that regard, it caused quite the controversy. Catholics are not universalists. We believe in hell. We believe that, unfortunately, many will suffer due to their choice to embrace a life away from God. But as a former staunch Calvinist, this statement not only challenged my theology, but spoke deeply to me. In my Protestant days, I was all too comfortable with people going to hell, and all too dismissive of the mercy of God to intervene outside of my structures and limitations. I think there's room in Catholicism to be hopeful universalists. That is to say that we hope in some surprising way that even the worst offender will embrace the mercy of God. And as a faith that prays for those who have passed on from this life because of our belief and hope in purgatory, I think there's room for hopeful universalists like Pope Francis. We pray for them because we have the hope of the mercy of God and of heaven. Now, I'm also an apologist, and so there were many things that Pope Francis said that caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up. In episode 115, I mentioned how Pope Francis attended an interfaith gathering last year and said, quote, "All religions are paths to God. I will use an analogy. They are like different languages that express the divine," end quote. Oof, that's, a problematic statement, I think. But I think if we try to paint Pope Francis' statement in its most charitable light, we would understand that he wasn't giving a theological lecture. He wasn't a theologian. He was trying to lead people to the mercy of God. He was speaking from the heart. There are those that preach to the choir. That wasn't Pope Francis. Whether it was in a television interview or homily or an interfaith gathering or a prison in Rome or a Hulu documentary, Pope Francis seemed like he was always aware of that person or persons on the outside listening in. He was always aware of that Zacchaeus character in the tree watching from a distance asking, "Is there a place for me here?" He was always thinking about and looking out for the marginalized. And I think this is what made him so misunderstood. The liberal news media wanted to paint the Pope as this ultra-progressive leader eager to change the church's teachings on issues like same-sex marriage. And those of us more theologically conservative-minded people would get so frustrated, particularly when Christians of other faiths would ask us, "What's up with your Pope?" When in reality, this wasn't Pope Francis's agenda. His agenda was always looking for opportunities to dine with the sinners and wash the feet of prisoners, to engage with those who wondered if there was a place for them inside the Catholic Church and inside the heart of Jesus. Some may accuse me of being overly generous to Pope Francis here. They may point to specific instances where the Pope said or did something really problematic, and I don't feel the need to defend everything Pope Francis said or did. It is our right and even our duty at times to disagree with our pastors, but our obligation to do so respectfully. And that's another lesson that I've learned during Pope Francis's tenure. As a theologically conservative-minded Christian, it's how to love and submit to someone even when I disagree with them. One of my biggest hang-ups in becoming Catholic was the idea of a pope, a supreme leader of the church. I grew up in Baptist congregations, which are very democratic structures, so this idea of a monarch church government was foreign to me. And because we were very familiar with Protestant Reformation history, or at least our version of it, we were all warned of the dangers of the papacy. I've heard some Catholics call Pope Francis the worst pope in history, which is mind-boggling absurd. If you want to hear about the worst popes in history, listen to episode 112. Let's just say that those popes would have likely been visiting brothels on Holy Thursday, not prisons. For better or worse, Jesus left us with a pope. And because I believe it is the Holy Spirit at work in the College of Cardinals, there's always something God is trying to teach us through the Vicar of Christ. It would be foolish to think that we will always agree with everything this person does. A church that looks like me and does everything I want, after all, is not a church. It's an idol. Church is meant to challenge us. And the best way it challenges us, the way it challenges us the most, is to grow in holiness, to draw closer to Jesus, and to draw people around us closer to him as well. And if there's a legacy and lesson Pope Francis left us, it's just that. We can never be humble enough. We can never love too much. We can never be too close to Jesus. To walk in humility and to love and serve, especially the marginalized, is the way of Jesus. Thank you, Holy Father, Pope Francis, for your service to the bride of Christ. May you now rest in your Father's house, reaping the fruit of your labor. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.